The key question is, how did the new Kingdom of Italy function during the first decade of its existence? This last section considers the condition of the Italian people during the years between the proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861 and the events that finally completed the process of unification in 1870. We will assess how the new Italian state functioned during its first decade, examine the problems it faced, the policies it pursued, and the economic and social progress that was made. In the end, you will be able to assess whether life improved for Italians and therefore whether unification had been worthwhile. After the proclamation of Victor Emmanuel II as King of Italy in May 1861, Piedmont's Prime Minister Diaz-Galileo remarked, "Italy is made, now we must make Italians." It was a pertinent remark. Victor Emmanuel II, scornful of his new subjects, who did not seem to understand that they now belonged to the nation of which he was head, voiced his opinion that there were only two ways of governing Italians, by bayonets or by bribery. Pope Pius IX was not joyful and quickly became a problem for the new state. Already in 1860, Pius had lost the majority of land making up the Papal States. As worldly power began to slip from his grasp, he concentrated on strengthening his spiritual power over the Church and its members. In 1864, the man who had been thought progressive published the controversial Syllabus of Errors, which, turning the Church away from the material world, condemned, among other things, progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. He was also against religious toleration. In July 1870, he went further with the doctrine of papal infallibility, which decreed that the Pope's spiritual judgment on matters of faith and morals could not be challenged, as he was the supreme judge of truth for the Catholic Church. Now, 3 months later, Rome became the capital city of Italy, and the Pope, distressed by what he called the triumph of disorder and the victory of wicked revolution, found himself left with only 109 acres of land, making up the area called the Patrimony of St. Peter. He retired into his palace of the Vatican, describing himself as its prisoner. He was offered a state pension but refused it, and instead excommunicated Victor Emmanuel and the government. Pius IX was determined to demonstrate his continued spiritual importance. As head of the Catholic Church, he announced that any Catholics who took part in Italian politics or even worked for the secular new state would be excommunicated, and that was an incredibly powerful tool. Now, 3 months later, Rome became the capital of Italy, and the Pope, distressed by what he called the triumph of disorder and the victory of wicked revolution, found himself left with only 109 acres of land, making up the area called the Patrimony of St. Peter. He retired into his palace of the Vatican, describing himself as its prisoner. He was offered a state pension but refused it, and instead excommunicated Victor Emmanuel and the government. Pius IX was determined to demonstrate his continued spiritual importance. As head of the Catholic Church, he announced that any Catholics who took part in Italian politics or worked for the new secular state would be excommunicated. Through its beliefs, ritual, and language, the Catholic Church had always been the main unifying element within the country. Now, even though Catholicism remained the state religion, those many liberal-minded Catholics who supported the new secular government but also wished to keep the faith found themselves in difficulties. The old balanced relationship between church and state no longer existed. It threatened instead to become a bitter clash of personalities and values, as over the next 2 decades the Pope became ever more hostile to the Italian state. Apart from the question of the Pope, the government found itself with a number of other problems, which the poor qualities of most of Cavour's successors as prime minister during the 1860s did nothing to help. None was charismatic, none had the leadership qualities of the heroes of unification, and many remained in power for only a short time. One prime minister who suffered a mental breakdown tried to stab the king and was removed from office only after 3 months. And another prime minister became involved in Garibaldi's failed attacks on Rome in 1862 and 1867 and was forced to resign. Nevertheless, Italian historians argue that, in their own way, members of the Italian governments in the 1860s and 1870s did good work establishing the new kingdom, and that they were just as successful and important as those of earlier years. In 1928, the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce wrote a spirited defense of these governments as made up of men of noble and self-sacrificing character and upright and loyal gentlemen. Remember, that was also during the time of Mussolini. Other historians, however, such as the communist Gramsci, described them as essentially undemocratic. It is easy to see why he thought this if we look at the constitution of the new state. The Italy of 1861 was a constitutional monarchy, not the republic that Mazzini had dreamed about and worked for, nor the federation under the Pope as Ghiberti and later Cavour and Napoleon III had proposed at Plombières. The constitution was based on Charles Albert's Statute of 1848, and the Piedmontese example was closely followed. It was the King of Piedmont who became Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel II. No matter that he was the first king of Italy, he was also first king of Piedmont. Ultimate constitutional power lay with the king and parliament, not the people, as Mazzini had hoped. As a result, Mazzini described the new Italian state as a sham. The new regime did not turn Italy into a true democracy, but only into what has been described as a sham democracy. The government was made up of members of the Piedmontese nobility and of the educated middle-class minority who formed an elite. And the all-male parliament was elected by a very narrow framework of voters. These too were all male, over 25 years old, literate, and tax-paying, about 2% of the population, and most of them from northern Italy. It was not surprising that Parliament consisted almost entirely of well-to-do, traditionally minded liberals, and was totally unrepresentative of the mass of the Italian people. However, some progress was made towards a more unified nation. The various legal codes or collections of laws of individual states were forced into a single criminal code based on that of Piedmont and quickly introduced everywhere else except Tuscany, which kept its own moderate code. In 1865, a single system of civil law, similar to France's Code Napoleon, was adopted throughout the country. It allowed civil marriage, although divorce remained illegal. During the 1860s, a united Italian army was formed out of the old armies of Piedmont, Naples, and the central Italian states, plus Garibaldi's Army of the South. The whole army was modernized and organized along Prussian lines. The navies of Piedmont and Naples were also combined into a single force, although not until 1876 was there any attempt at modernizing or reorganizing it. Schools and universities came under state control as part of a policy to provide a unified system of education throughout the peninsula. Another key question to answer is, what were the main social and economic problems of Italy? The government was faced with serious geographical, social, political, and economic problems by the need to unite two very different areas of the country: the prosperous, semi-industrialized, advanced north, comprising Piedmont and her immediate neighbors, and the poor, agriculturally based, backward south, the regions to the south of the Papal States. Cavour had realized the enormous problems involved in uniting northern and southern Italy, claiming that to harmonize the north with the south is more difficult than to fight Austria or to struggle with Rome. The new government in the north at first tried to deal with the problem by ignoring it. When that did not work, it used the quite unsuitable solution of forcing a Piedmontese style of government on the south. It was unsuitable because in Naples and Sicily, the problems were not so much political as social and economic. The majority of the population was illiterate and lived in poverty and squalor at a level of near starvation. As a small number of great landowners continued to enclose land to add to their estates, known as latifundia, there was less and less land available for the peasants. When the old common land disappeared into the great estates, peasant families could not feed themselves as they had done before, for they did not now have land on which to graze cattle or to grow crops. The government again showed its total lack of understanding of the situation by introducing higher taxation. The cost of living rose and the quality of peasant life fell even lower as they struggled to pay the new taxes. Their life was further complicated by new, difficult to understand legal systems, and worst of all, by conscription, which took the young men away from the farms where they were needed. In 1861, around 25,000 of them took to the hills of Naples and Sicily to avoid military service. They scraped a living as bandits instead. Many in the west of Sicily joined the mafia, which, taking advantage of the general social unrest, was thriving as public opinion in the South turned not just against the landowners, but also against Victor Emmanuel II and Piedmont. Peasant families began migrating to towns in search of work and often finding none, became part of the growing underclass of semi-destitute people whose only hope of food and shelter was to turn to crime. This was particularly the case in Palermo, the capital of Sicily, and in the overcrowded city of Naples, where the respectable citizens were put in fear of their lives by the half-starved beggars. In the early 1860s, law and order, never very strong in Sicily and Naples, broke down totally. Bandits became bolder and more numerous as rural discontent fueled a revolution, which soon turned into a civil war, in which more people were killed than all the revolutions and wars of the Unification period. A Piedmontese army of some 100,000 men was called in to suppress the disorder. It took them over 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, to do so. Government ministers still made no real attempt to understand what was happening in the South. Naples, they believed, was rotten. Neapolitans were barbarians, idle, politically corrupt, and backward. They brought their troubles on themselves by their business, sitting about in the sun instead of working. At the root of the government's attitude was belief in the rightness of Cavour's original plan to reorganize the whole peninsula on the Piedmontese model, and in the area that the South held great wealth, just waiting for the North to take and use it. On both counts they were wrong, and attempts to put them into practice only had the effect of increasing the growth of industry in the North while making matters socially and economically worse in the South. Throughout the 1860s, North and South remained as far apart as ever. Living standards fell throughout Italy for all social classes as the government struggled to balance the books. In the mid-1860s, when Venetia was added to the kingdom, the government's total spending exceeded its income by 60%. The level of taxation was decided not by Parliament, but by the king alone, and unfortunately his main interest was in making war, the most expensive activity any country can indulge in. To pay for his military activities, taxes had to be raised, and in 1868 the unpopular tax on grinding corn was revived. The increased taxes fell mostly heavily on the peasants, who could least afford to pay. Many, finding that they could not survive on the produce of their few acres, moved into towns, as large numbers of others had done before them. Extensive research has been done on this topic in recent decades by Italian historians. After unification, women found themselves at first, as they had been before, second-class citizens in a macho society, both in the home, where in all social classes a wife was legally subject to her husband, and in the workplace, where working women were actively discouraged from joining the new mutual aid societies, which were the forerunners of trade unions. In 1862, only about 10,000 women, as opposed to about 100,000 men, were members, and women continued to be paid half as much as men for the same work and the same long hours. Sound familiar? In 1860s in the towns, the availability of cheap housing close to factories, which is where most of the work was available, became very important to working women. They were no longer restricted to outwork in the home or to laboring in quarries and fields or on the roads. Until the 1870s, women continued to work at home, especially once the treadle sewing machine came into use, but increasing numbers of women moved into the factories. For many, the work was making cigars, a job done exclusively by women. In one of the 20 state-owned factories, 500 workers produced 700 kilograms of cigars a day. The hours were long and the pay was low, but there was company in the rows of workers sitting side by side on high stools in the large, warm rooms. Yet there was widespread tuberculosis caused by the overcrowded and unsanitary housing of the poor, and by the fact that workers were undernourished. There was no treatment. It only needed one infected woman to be working in an unventilated workroom, and dozens alongside her would catch the disease. Factory records show that thousands of women on their books died from tuberculosis. Unfortunately, almost every job women turned their hands to brought them illness and deformity, whether it was making leather gloves on the cumbersome sewing machine, which meant hours of working in a cramped position, or catching a fever standing in dirty, cold, stagnant water up to their waist for hours at a time, soaking flax and hemp ready for spinning, or working along with their children in the newly planted rice fields of Piedmont and Lombardy, their feet and legs in muddy water from 1 hour after another until sunset as they tended the rice plants. As a result, death from malaria was common among rice workers. Working in hazardous conditions in the factories seemed preferable to many women. In Piedmont alone, 36,000 women worked in the silk industry in factories where their hands were ruined by boiling water in the process of reeling the silk thread off the cocoons. The old domestic standbys of spinning and weaving came to an end when competition from the new cotton cloth imports shook the textile industry to its foundations and led to change. From the late 1860s onwards, cloth production moved into the factory and into the machine age, producing unexpected effects on family life. Spinning and weaving in the home had previously involved the whole family, bringing together men, women, and children. Factory work destroyed the family as a self-contained production unit and changed the division of labor between men and women. As a result, there was a great increase in the number of babies left at fondling homes to free their mothers for work. The introduction of mechanized looms in factories eliminated the heavy work of weaving previously done by men. They found themselves no longer needed and were replaced as weavers by women and girls who were cheaper to employ, often leaving the men without work. This disturbed the long accepted social relationships within peasant and other working families because for the first time on any large scale, male domination was challenged as women became independent wage earners outside the home. The majority of Italians, men as well as women, must have wondered what was so wonderful about the self-governing and united Italy, as their lot remained arduous and poverty-stricken. Was this really the glorious unification they had heard about? In the end, regardless of whether it was good or bad, Unification happened. Diplomacy, war, and the rivalries between Cavour and Garibaldi were obviously vital factors in the unification of Italy. Nevertheless, the romantic pull of poets and writers persists and seems likely to continue to do so. Its ideals were important because they provided an emotional and political appeal, giving at least some Italians a common identity and purpose, which fueled the nationalist cause both before and after unification. Italy was not unified solely by wars and the intrigues and rivalries of politicians. Nationalism played a part. National feeling did rouse a section of public opinion to support Piedmont's ambitions to lead a unified Italy and to provide its first king and its first national constitution. Without nationalists supporting a united Italy as early as 1861 would not have been possible.